Hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in today to this third Live Green UK Sustainability webinar. We are missing our usual host today, Greg Pormley, CEO of Live, as he's just wrapping up somewhere else. He will hopefully join us later, but it's up to us, myself and Claire, to welcome you today. So Live Green has been working on this draft Live Beyond Zero vision and commitment for climate and environmental action from the UK live music community. It's gone through a few different iterations and working groups and steering group stages, and these webinars are part of a wider consultation with the whole live music community to go over what is the vision, what does it mean for different parts of the live sector, how do we get there, and what do we do next. So they're your opportunity really to hear more and ask questions, and we urge you to please do ask your questions, share your thoughts using the chat function, and we will try to get to as many of them towards the end of the session as possible. So my name is Cara. I work at a charity called Julie's Bicycle. I've been part of one of the working groups supporting the vision, and also with me is Claire O'Neill from A Greener Festival, who's also been part of one of the working groups. Hi, Claire.
Hello, thank you for that lovely intro. Also, I just wanted to say it's really quite poignant that normally we'd be at Glastonbury right now. So we're using the time very well by looking at what we're going to do collectively to come back sustainably. So that's one plus, at least, for not being in the fields this week.
Definitely. And I think we're all aware that continues to be a really tricky week for everyone. So if you have tuned in to spend the time with us, it means a lot. Thank you for taking your time to join with us and have this conversation. So to give a bit of background on Julie's Bicycle and me, so we were founded nearly 15 years ago from within the UK music industry to kind of help and support the industry to take action, mainly on climate change and other environmental challenges. We still do that and also work with the wider performing and visual arts through consultancy, certification, research, training, helping to get new networks and programs off the ground. So really trying to work at wherever we can to help make stuff happen. So today, as I said, we're going to go through that Live Beyond Zero vision. And if we could have the slides up from here, that would be fantastic. So to go through it, the draft at the moment reads, "This is not a rehearsal. We commit to a regenerative future, taking the lead on climate action and collaborating towards a sustainable society. We acknowledge responsibility for individual and collective actions to make ongoing absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and reach net zero by 2030. We'll work together with our stakeholders to inspire positive change in areas outside our direct control." So that's the draft vision. Today's sort of workshop spotlight is on festivals. You can also watch back the previous two sessions, which were on touring and offices. And then next week, we have two more sessions on venues and for artists and management. If you have tuned in to one of the previous sessions, there's going to be a little bit of overlap. Please bear with us, or again, take the time to share your thoughts and questions in the chat and sort of participate in the discussion. So the reason we're here is that we are in the middle of doing a massive experiment, really, with this planet, which is our only home. Climate change is a heart down to human activity, pretty much entirely, because we're burning through energy that's been stored up by plants over millions of years, and we're burning through that energy in the space of about 100 years. So if you imagine the atmosphere as a bathtub with all the taps running, we've added extra taps in a bucket, and we're putting more so-called greenhouse gases in than natural sinks and processes can remove. So that bathtub, the atmosphere, is quickly filling up with all these extra greenhouse gases. And all of them, they're called greenhouse gases because they regulate temperature. And because we've put so many extra in the atmosphere, it means that it's now hotter than it has been in the entire history of human civilization. So we're kind of leaving the known. And the climate won't stop changing until we stop putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So this is largely a one-way street. Where we are now with the current droughts and heat waves and weird weather is here to stay. We can't really go back, not on timescales that mean very much to us. But we do get to decide how much worse and how much weirder this gets. It's not an exaggeration to say that decisions we make now in these next 10 years are going to set the course for the next millennium on this planet. So this isn't just another kind of thing on the to-do list. Climate change often gets called a threat multiplier because it affects and it interacts with every single other priority we have, from the food we eat to the water we drink, where we can live, how we can live. And so what matters to climate change isn't just how much we're putting in a given year, but how much extra greenhouse gases we've put in total in the atmosphere over time, because especially carbon, the main one, sticks around pretty much forever on timescales that matter to us. So we have to roughly cut global emissions in half every decade from here on and get to net zero carbon emissions globally by 2050. So that also means that we, more or less, the people who are alive and working now, have to be the ones to solve climate change. We can look at that both as kind of a daunting challenge, or we can also look at it as, this is the opportunity that we've been given. It's both a huge responsibility, but also, again, we get to shape what the future looks like. And we can do that by doing two things, especially those of us who are living in Europe, North America, countries that have contributed a lot to historical emissions, so that have already put a lot of that extra greenhouse gas emissions in the bathtub, and continue to be responsible for many more emissions than people living in other parts of the world. We have to cut our impacts, and we also have to push for bigger picture change in laws and policies and investments. So net zero, as is outlined in the vision, is an idea that really comes from this knowledge that the climate is not going to stop changing until we stop filling up the bathtub. So we have to get to a point where globally across the world, the sources of greenhouse gas emissions have to be equal to or less than the sinks, so the stuff that's pulling greenhouse gases back out of the atmosphere. What that means in practice actually is reducing emissions. We have to get to nearly zero. And we're only netting the remaining emissions by removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. But we can't net ourselves out of the current levels of emissions that we're putting in the atmosphere every year. We don't have enough land to plant trees. We don't have enough technology that removes greenhouse gases again. So for your net zero roadmaps, most of what we're doing really is reducing emissions. We can't just rely on the greenhouse gas removals. If we tried to do that, it would be a bit like using a cup to try to get water out of the bathtub while a fire hose was still pumping water in. To kind of turn off the sources can be useful to understand where greenhouse gases come from in the first place. So the main one and the most important one in a lot of ways is carbon dioxide. It's very long-lived. It's basically permanent in the atmosphere on timescales that matter for us. And it's the majority of the extra emissions that we're putting in the atmosphere at the moment. The main sources are the burning of fossil fuels, so things like coal, oil, or gas for energy that we use for electricity, heating, transport. A second important greenhouse gas is methane, which is stronger than carbon in terms of the amount of warming that it causes in the atmosphere, but it doesn't stick around for as long. And methane mainly comes from agriculture, so how we manage our soils, livestock, cow burps famously, and also from landfill, where organic matter is sort of decomposing and letting off methane as it does that. In the festival industry, there's a few different drivers for change. The first one, which should be enough, is that it's the right thing to do. The consequences of not tackling climate change are basically unimaginable. In a lot of ways, taking action is the only thing we can do. A second one is that people are worried that our staff, crew, audiences, artists you work with, 8 in 10 people in the UK are very or fairly concerned about climate change. And it's in your power as an event organizer to respond to that concern. And in the annual sort of festival industry green survey that we run with Vision 2025, the concern and commitment of staff is also cited by most festivals as the main driver for action. So actually you're responding to a demand from the people that you're working with. Other surveys that were done in 2019 of festival audiences also saw an increase in the number of attendees and festival goers who say that they care more about the overall environmental and sustainability impacts of festivals than they did in previous years. And people actually chose the festival promotes environmental sustainability as a factor in selecting which festival to attend. It's not as important as things like the previous experience or lineup or friends going, but more people did choose that the festival promotes environmental sustainability as a factor than people chose things like the provision of non-musical attractions and entertainment. So it's something that's going up the agenda. We are in a slightly strange in-between space at the moment, but nearly 3 in 4 councils across the UK have also declared a climate emergency. They're pulling together their action plans and policies for what that looks like. And we can expect a lot more requirements to come from local authorities and licensing, and questions being asked about how the festivals and events that take place locally are helping them to achieve their climate roadmaps. And you can also, as a business happening in that community, support those declarations positively. Another driver is creativity. So figuring out how we respond to the climate emergency is in a lot of ways a creative challenge. And people who pull together events are nothing if not resourceful. You're creating a whole other world for people to immerse themselves in, and that opens up lots of other opportunities for collaboration, which we've seen many events start to take, using events really as laboratories for the zero carbon society that we have to make out there. Another driver is responding to other legislation that's either in place already or coming. For example, recent changes announced by Treasury that seem to remove the entitlement to rebated red diesel and biofuels for commercial events. So that could have an impact in terms of pushing up the cost of fuel, meaning there's more of a financial incentive to reduce fuel use and invest in energy efficiency. Managing risk, so like the reputational, financial and legal ones we've just gone through. But the other thing is that we all know, I think, that outdoor events are particularly exposed to the risks of a changing climate that's less stable and more unpredictable and with more weather extremes. So this is in many ways actually an existential question for the events industry as well. Climate change in the UK means that summers are going to get drier overall, so longer heat waves. Anyone who's tried to build an event in one of the heat waves of the past couple of summers is going to know that that's not very nice. So summers are drier overall, but when the rain does fall, it's going to do so in heavier bursts. Again, a bit of a nightmare for festival and event infrastructure. And the impacts of that are known on audience experience, extra costs around weatherproofing infrastructure and contingencies, insurance costs, travel disruptions, and risks of cancellations. So again, I think we're all very sensitive to that after the year and a half we've just had. And climate change is another sort of risk multiplier on a similar level. And lastly, there is something, a driver for change in terms of working together through the Live Green Beyond Zero vision, coming together with other shared commitments in the sector, like the Vision 2025 pledge, like communities that are growing up around commitments like Creative Green and a Greener Festival. And so in the UK, we have a Climate Change Act that has targets from the government. There are some scenarios that the so-called Committee on Climate Change uses to inform UK policy. That doesn't mean this is exactly what's going to happen, but it does mean that these scenarios are one way of achieving the net zero aim that the UK government has. So you can kind of think of these scenarios as a more or less the minimum we have to do over the next 30 years. A lot of people say we have to be more ambitious than this. And so I won't dwell on this for too long, but looking through it. So one of the key things we have to do is change how electricity is made, so it's zero carbon, and actually making a lot more electricity so that we can power all the stuff we want to shift away from gas, diesel and other sort of fuels to being powered by electricity, by the new renewable green zero carbon electricity we're making. So if you're a festival that does work with any venues, that might mean asking them how they're powered. And if you use any mains grid power on your site, it's worth asking who the supplier is and trying to shift to a renewable electricity tariff. Transport is the biggest source of emissions in the UK at the moment. for road and surface transport to get to net zero in the UK means that by 2050, there shouldn't be anything that's powered by petrol or diesel on our roads anymore. So that means a few things have to happen. We have to drive fewer miles overall. The share of audiences traveling to festivals by car has actually grown over the last 5 to 10 years, which surveys from people like the Association of Independent Festivals show, while the share traveling by train's fallen. And that was before the pandemic, I think, raised more concerns for audiences traveling by public transport. So as a festival sector, we should be doing everything we can to reverse that trend, working with audiences to incentivize and push them to travel by train, walk, travel by bicycle, or travel by coach. Longer term, also thinking about, either shifting away from event sites where public transport connections are bad, especially if you're looking for a new event site, thinking about marketing to local audiences to increase that share that can arrive by sustainable means. It could mean working with suppliers who are tackling their own transport emissions by shifting to electric freight vans, grouping deliveries, or even working with local suppliers where possible. And the festival industry also needs to stay on top of actually the growing share of electric vehicles that our audiences are going to have. It's not a great idea to charge an electric car from a generator. So finding new solutions to accommodate our audiences who are traveling by electric cars is going to be one of the big technical questions, I think, facing us over the next 5 to 10 years. In the same way that we have to get rid of diesel and petrol vehicles on our roads, we also have to have a plan for phasing out diesel generators by being more efficient, shifting to other technologies like mains grid connections, batteries, and similar. So by 2050, all of the small and medium so-called off-road mobile machinery is electrically powered in the UK. Biofuels like HVO are a bridge fuel really over the next 5 to 10 years. There's a limited supply of sustainable biofuels overall, and we need it for other things. So working with our power suppliers to try out new solutions and have that plan for how we're going to slowly phase out diesel generators, again, is going to have to be a real focus over the next 5 to 10 years. A more circular economy, so using products longer, reusing materials, shifting from high carbon materials to lower carbon materials. For festivals, that means thinking through what materials are coming on site and how are you using them. Looking, for example, at where the timber and other stuff that you use for your site builds comes from, and crucially, what happens to it at the end of the event. In agriculture and land use, the main aim is to free up agricultural land so that we can give it back to nature, use it for things like tree planting. And a big part of that, freeing up that land, is reducing how much meat and dairy we eat. So a couple of the Committee on Climate Change scenarios see us reducing meat and dairy by about 20 to 40% by 2050. So there's a real opportunity here for events to influence change through the kind of food concessions that through the food that gets served at our events. And then lastly, air travel. We don't have the technology to make flying zero carbon on the timelines needed. So scenarios are quite clear that we can't grow the amount we fly from here. If anything, there has to be a reduction in the number of flights taken. In the UK, 15% of people take 70% of all flights. So that's something really to consider for our business travel and events. And it's also something to consider in relation to whether we're marketing to overseas visitors and how. So a carbon footprint is the measure of the climate change impact of a business, of an activity, of a product, of a country. And it's kind of the sum of the climate impact of different activities or things expressed as a single number, usually with the unit of carbon dioxide equivalent, so which is a standard metric where you convert the other greenhouse gases into its carbon dioxide equivalent. And you can calculate a carbon footprint by using things called carbon conversion factors that are assigned. So, for example, if you have a kilowatt hour of energy or electricity that you're using, that's equivalent to a certain number of kilos of carbon. Waste ton of landfill, again, that's equivalent to a number of kilos of carbon. There are some things like burning a litre of diesel that have more or less the same carbon footprint wherever you are in the world, but not everything does. So a venue using the same amount of electricity has a different carbon footprint depending on where it is and how that electricity it's using is generated and made. And not everything is directly measured in that same way. So if you expand the question to ask, what's the carbon footprint of a tomato? That actually depends on how the land it's grown on is managed, how the farm machinery is powered, whether it's been grown in a greenhouse. So you start getting a little bit more complicated the further away you move from the burning of fossil fuels. So to try and keep some consistency for how businesses report their carbon footprint, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is an internationally accepted framework for greenhouse gas accounting for businesses. And it tries to put the responsibility for emissions as close to the source of where those fossil fuels are burned. Again, largely related to the fact that it's easier to make that calculation in a lot of ways. So scope, and it does that by dividing your emissions into 3 different scopes. So scope 1 are the emissions from owned or operated assets. So things like gas boilers, company-owned vehicles, generators that you own or operate or control. Scope 2 is the emissions from the energy you buy that's generated somewhere else. So mainly that's electricity. And scope 3 is the emissions from everything else. So that could be business travel, could be audience travel, the goods and services you buy, waste processing. So that's sometimes called the value chain of a business. And that accounting framework is sometimes a good way to think of our impacts, but another really important one is to think in terms of our spheres and levers of control. So, for example, there's what you control directly, and for a festival, that is going to be things like how you manage your power. There's what you can influence, and that might be things like how your audiences are traveling to the festival. And then there's what you don't directly influence, but that does impact your environmental impact overall, where you might have to campaign for bigger picture change. And that's things like local investment into public transport infrastructure. So coming back to that live Beyond Zero vision, work in progress, we commit to a regenerative future. So giving back more than we take, taking the lead on climate action, collaborating towards a sustainable society. So contributing to those scenarios and those roadmaps that we just went through. We acknowledge responsibility for individual and collective actions to make ongoing absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and reach net zero by 2030. We'll work together with our stakeholders to inspire positive change in areas outside our direct control. For the next 10 years, that means our focus is on reducing emissions, working with others to reduce theirs, and asking for that bigger picture change. There is a commitment that net zero from 2030, that you'll match whatever emissions are left with an equivalent amount of greenhouse gas removals, but that net removal comes after the reduction. So the focus over the next 10 years is reducing our emissions. And we can think of that across 3 areas. So how live music businesses, events, venues, tours are run, how we role model green investments, technologies, actions, and behaviors, how you support your audiences, artists, and others working with you and visiting you to do the right thing and to reduce their impacts, and how you use your platforms to call for and support change. The Live Beyond Zero Work in Progress Declaration for individual businesses is I or we will work towards the following: work with Live Green to reduce our operational and business travel greenhouse gas emissions, set reduction targets in line with the Live Green vision, measure and report progress annually, focusing on scopes 1 and 2 in business travel, develop a net zero roadmap and action plan, taking responsibility for actions in energy, waste, procurement, transport, food, and governance or strategy, understand and define emissions within our value chain, so there's scope 3 impacts, follow best practice to affect change in areas outside of our direct control, and collaborate with suppliers and clients towards the Live Beyond Zero vision. Ensure people undertake climate literacy education and have an ongoing commitment to knowledge sharing within the live music sector and beyond. So coming together really and sharing our experiences and what we know. And talking to our stakeholders honestly about the impacts of our business on the environment and efforts we're making towards a regenerative future. So for a festival, looking through those pieces, there's measuring and publicly reporting Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and emissions from business travel. So for a festival, the information you need is stuff like the fuel use and liters on site from generators and the on-site transport that's in your control, so things like buggies, any mains electricity use, and any other direct sort of Scope 1 energy emissions or Scope 2 energy emissions from your site, things like how much bottled gas you're using. From your office, it means the Scope 2 electricity use and the gas use, Scope 1 gas use in your office. You can get that off utility bills. And if you have any owned or operated vehicles throughout the year, litres of fuel or mileage that those are doing. And on the business travel side, it's the number of flights that are being taken, and whether they're long haul or short haul, or better yet, if you can capture the distance you're flying and what class, the number of hotel nights, taxis and any other staff mileage that's being reimbursed, and the distance of train travel. So capturing that data and information. Set a 2030 reduction target, covers as a minimum Scope 1 and 2 emissions in business travel. That's in line with the Live Vision and science-based target pathways. So for businesses, the exact pathway depends a little bit on science-based target initiative criteria, but a good rule of thumb is that we're roughly looking to halve reductions every decade from now until 2050. Develop and follow a roadmap and action plan. So including different actions, organising training for staff and crew, or giving them permission to attend climate literacy training workshops and be part of information exchange networks, putting climate on the agenda in meetings and out there with crew, staff, partners, audiences, suppliers. So talking about it, being part of Live Green and sort of contributing to that information and knowledge sharing, and also benefiting from the centralized support that's coming, and contributing to permanent emissions drawdown solutions from 2030. So in terms of festival action plans, we know the reductions sort of for Scope 1, Scope 2 are possible. Julie's Bicycle, together with what has become the Vision 2025 steering group, we first asked the question, what would it take for the UK festival industry to meet or exceed the targets of the UK Climate Change Act in 2015? We modelled those interventions in the first edition of the Show Must Go On report. So what it would take really to reduce impacts from energy, waste, audience travel by half from 2014 levels by 2025. It wasn't going to be easy, but there was not much in there that seemed impossible, and especially on the energy side, which is what this draft Live Beyond Zero vision would ask for action in. There's a lot of precedence of people achieving that level of reduction. So in terms of our festival action plans, it's making a commitment to environmental action, embedding it alongside financial and artistic considerations, sharing that ambition with people you work with, making someone responsible for overseeing your commitments, including someone who's in charge of gathering and reporting that data, even if they're not doing it directly, someone who can chase other people for the information that's needed, and coordinating that action plan, making sure they're resourced to do this. So more and more events, especially larger ones, do have part-time or full-time sustainability coordinators, but it could be also someone on your core festival team that takes on this responsibility. Putting in place an action plan and environmental policy, why this matters to you, what you've identified to be your impacts, a plan for how you're tackling them, and what you want and can share with others. Having a public information page on your website that outlines your commitments and actions. We've just had a question through. Yes, we will make the slides available to share through Live after this. So don't worry, there is a lot of information on some of them, but you will have it in written version after this. And please, again, if any other questions come up, do share them in the chat comments as we're going. So measuring impacts and putting in place targets to reduce them. Starting with those scopes 1 and 2, power and electricity use, business travel, and having a plan for how you might collect information on other areas further down the line. You can use the Julie's Bicycle Creative Green tools for festivals, which are free to use, or contact a consultancy for more support on how you do that. You can set an internal price per tonne of emissions and invest it in climate projects, make equivalent donations to climate justice causes, use it to build up an internal budget for the kind of investment that you need to reduce emissions over the next 10 years. On energy, working with your power contractor to follow the power management hierarchy, reducing demand, increasing efficiency through better system design, using alternatives to diesel fuel, and including efficiency and monitoring asks in power contracts. Transport and travel, an audience survey can be really, really helpful to understand where people are traveling from, how they're getting to you. And based on that, you can shape incentives for getting more people to take public transport, walk or cycle, or travel by dedicated coach. You can bundle a percentage of tickets to only be available as part of a coach travel. You can also use different rewards and disincentives to try and get more people to either leave their cars at home completely or at least come sharing cars. Working with suppliers to reduce transport impacts as well. And on the business travel side, identifying whether there's any international travel that you're doing year round that you could reduce, and where possible for that, if you're going to visit, say, a showcase event, flying economy, or of course taking the train. So on procurement and partners, working with suppliers and partners who share your ambitions, who have their own environmental action plans, talking to them how they can support you, putting in place minimum environmental standards, things like FSC certified timber for any set builds, working with and talking to your local authority on environmental projects. You know, what does your local climate action plan say? What does the local transport strategy say? And how can you fit in with that? And looking through your partners and sponsors and considering whether they match your environmental ambitions. On waste and resources, developing a waste and resource management strategy, focusing on reduction. Reusable cups is a really big part of that. And also matching what you buy to your waste services. So understanding where your waste is going at the end of its life. Not everything that can be recycled will be recycled if you don't have the right systems in place. So that also means getting smart on things like bioplastics and other plastic alternatives, because many of them need their own waste solutions. It's not enough to shift. You still have to make sure it goes to the right place at the end of its life. Targeting food waste reduction and eliminating biodegradable waste from being sent to landfill is a really big one under the Committee on Climate Change Act scenarios. And on the food side, including plenty of vegetarian and vegan options as part of the food offer, or even going 100% meat and fish free. One easy thing to track is the number of meat-free dishes that you actually have on offer from across your traders, as an easy way to sort of monitor progress on that. And setting minimum standards for traders and bars and foods sourcing and serveware and packaging. So this is just, data is important to measure. You have to measure to manage and understand. So on the left is two examples. Festival B actually has a much higher capacity than Festival A, but they have relatively similar total carbon footprints from energy, water, waste, and audience travel. Because Festival A with the lower capacity has a much higher percentage of arrivals by car, meaning it has a comparatively higher audience travel carbon footprint. Festival B has a much lower percentage of arrivals, audience travel arrivals by car, because it's located closer to public transport. And it also it has a relatively lower energy footprint because some of its energy comes from mains energy. So even though it's a higher capacity event, it's managed to switch some of that demand over to mains, which has a lower carbon footprint. So in terms of zooming in on power, these figures were taken from the last edition of the Show Must Go On report, which was published with Vision 2025 at the start of last year. So the energy chapter was guest authored by Tim Benson from Smart Power, Zap Concepts, and who chairs Powerful Thinking. And so we've seen lots of examples of events that can achieve 20 or even 40% fuel savings through better power planning from beginning to end, following that power management hierarchy of prevention. Do you actually need power in this location or for this application? Efficiency, using less power, using it in a more fuel efficient way. Sourcing, so shifting to mains grid power instead of generators. Hybrids, so can you bring in things like battery technology to reduce your fuel use, shifting over to HVO or other sustainable fuels, relatively low down in the pecking order. efficiency should always come first, and only using diesel generators where nothing else can be used. So you can see on the right the difference in emissions from different power sources. So just a couple of quick examples. AEG Live, Loud Sound and Power Logistics, working together at Hyde Park British Summertime, achieved a 25% fuel use reduction in 2019 using real-time power monitoring across the site using some battery technology. Zap Concepts, working with Body and Soul in Ireland in 2018 on better power design, downsizing generators, 15% from the previous year. Overnight switch-offs, introduced power monitoring, saved overall 22% of diesel against the previous year. Greenbelt Festival has halved their fuel use in 3 years since first starting to monitor power in 2016. And power suppliers like Pierce Hire are also working with their clients on things like better system design, bringing in LED floodlights and festoon, circuit controls, for example, achieving a 20% diesel reduction for the Bury St Edmunds Christmas Fair in 2019. So on this question of can we reduce power use, we do have a lot of solutions available. And a couple of other examples on most of these are on waste. So AIF, the Association of Independent Festivals, ran a super successful Take Your Tent Home campaign, asking people to please take responsibility for their tents. Drastic on Plastic commitment to go single-use plastic free for AIF members. Charity Frank Water Refill worked with 15 festivals in summer 2019, offering a refill solution, and they served nearly 170,000 refills across that season, hopefully displacing an equivalent number of plastic bottles from being used. Festival Republic ran a zero waste festival goer campaign in 2019, including videos shown on site, meaning they achieved a 50% reduction in tents left behind compared to 2017. Boomtown that year as well ran a big Leave No Trace campaign, sort of tied into their storyline, again reducing the number of tents left behind by 50% in a single year. Shambhala Festival has long been sort of leading a lot of best practice around this. Chris Johnson was one of the other people involved in the working group around the Vision Live Beyond Zero Vision. So they've gone meat and fish free to help shift audience behavior and start this conversation about what we eat and why we eat it. And running campaigns like Bring Your Own Bottle, banning single-use plastic bottles from site, Bringing Your Own Cup campaigns. Most recently putting a specific levy on single-use hot drink cups so they can be collected separately and sent to a specialist facility that can recycle them. So massively increasing the hot drinks cups that they captured for recycling in that way. Live Nation and Festival Republic also trialled a new plastic policy in 2019, a refill campaign, bottled water sold that had a minimum 30% recycled content in its plastic, and soft drinks that were dispensed from post-mix units, reducing overall single-use plastic bottles by half. I'll bring in Claire again now, if that's all right. We've still got her.
Hello. Yes,
hi, Claire.
Thanks for that, Claire. You've managed to put a huge amount of information into a short time. Well done.
Thanks.
Before I go into talking about this particular case study, which I'm one of my favourites, just to give a bit of context and background about AGF, for those who don't know. So
you're a little bit muffled.
Working directly with festivals, with the Greener Festival Award certification, helping to see where they are now and then make improvements. So that work, it's a very practical step-by-step user guide, essentially.
Claire, you're a little bit muffled, I think. Did you put something on your microphone?
Oh, I can't hear you. Can you not hear me either?
We can hear you.
I'm having sound issues.
If you want to have a moment to try and fix it, I can skip ahead. Yes, I think so. Try again.
Can you hear me okay? I can't hear Clara at all. Can I okay.
Yeah, why don't you take a hang on, Claire. Um, I'll let Claire try and sort her sound issues while and we'll come back to her in a minute. Um, so just moving forward again, some of the guides and resources that are out there, the Judy's Bicycle Creative Green tools, the IG tools, CG tools, they're free to use. If you have some information on your areas of impact, you can plug them in and get the carbon footprint on your Scope 1, Scope 2 and other areas. We've got lots of other free practical guides and resources like putting a price on carbon, looking at procurement, and of course, working with, we're the hosts, we hold Vision 2025 as a big sort of growing network of outdoor events and businesses that have taken a pledge to tackle their greenhouse gas emissions. So actually just this week, we've launched the new Vision 2025 website, which has an index of kind of free resources and guides that are relevant to any outdoor events. Please do also read the Show Must Go On report. It is dense, but it has a lot of brilliant information in it. We try to kind of bring together a lot of the experts working on outdoor event and festival sustainability to share with us basically the latest trends, where thinking is at, and what actions need to be taken. And of course, the Powerful Thinking Guide, which we publish through Powerful Thinking, again, also with lots of support from Tim Benson from Smart Power and Zap Concepts, really looking at how we can get better at managing power for festivals and events. And on the Powerful Thinking website, there's also specific fact sheets on different areas, from how you start putting this into contracts with power suppliers to how you can work with your traders on power. All of this comes back to this question, not just of how do we reduce our environmental impact, but also being very generous actually with our environmental vision. So how do we bring our creativity to fighting climate change, to supporting social justice, to giving back to the communities that our events take place in, contributing to livable cities and places, helping to restore nature. And there is lots and lots of help and community that is out there, from campaigns like Music Declares Emergency, to, again, networks like Powerful Thinking and Vision 2025, consultancy from the likes of Green Events, from Zap, who specialise in power solutions, from Hope Solutions, from A Greener Festival, from Judy's Bicycle, from Chris Johnson, and now also lots of support, hopefully, through the Live Green community that we're working out. So I don't know whether we've got Claire back yet. Claire is not back in yet. So we'll wait until Claire comes back to join the conversation. But in the interim, please do share any other questions that you have. This is your time to ask. Martin Bloor has asked, could all festivals get together and talk to public transport networks to see if we can offer festival goers a discount on travel if they're part of Live Green Festival Group? I think that is a brilliant idea, Martin, especially around train travel. Train passenger numbers are still very much down from what they were pre-pandemic. And there's a real opportunity here, I think, next year, or towards the end of this year, but definitely next year as well, to also celebrate that sort of, more stay-at-home tourism, travel by train to a festival in the UK instead of taking your weekend abroad. Hopefully we will be able to set something like that up. And I think every festival should be writing to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on rail travel, and coming together to sort of try and make this happen. It would be fantastic to see. Also in the EU, I think they may have had to postpone it given the pandemic, but this year was going to be the EU Year of Rail. Again, a big campaign to celebrate rail travel within Europe. So if that is now rescheduled for next year, it's another opportunity to kind of jump on that same message and campaign, and celebrate that around rail travel. Any other questions? Someone's asked whether the repetition at the start is necessary. A little bit, in that what we've really tried to do with some of these workshops is shape them so each one could be followed by people on their own, tackling different parts of the sector and the industry. But if you are looking forward to tuning in to one of the future ones on venues or artisan management, maybe you can tune in sort of 15 to 20 minutes into the event as well. If you would like, Jed, if there's something specific in terms of issues and answers that you'd like to discuss at this stage in time as well, please feel free to ask questions as we have some time left. And we have Claire back as well. Hi, Claire.
We hope so. Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Woo! Great. I'm in this little village called London, and the internet doesn't work very well all the time. So going back to the beginning, sorry for the disruption there. So for those that don't know about AGF, I'm just going to give a bit of a background, because we've been working with the festival industry for 15 years. We work with them internationally, from the scale of Glastonbury and Roskilde Festival through to Boomtown, Green Gathering, Cambridge Folk Festival, to smaller events like Lost Village or Wood Festival, for instance, in Oxfordshire. So it's quite a broad spectrum of events that we've been working with. And a lot has been for the Greener Festival Award, which is a certification that almost works like a guide, a practical guide. So all the things that Chiara has been referring to, for example, there's a self-assessment process, then auditors visit the site, and then we gather evidence and give feedback afterwards. So this has led to having a wonderful perspective of all the great best practice around the world for festivals, and many years of dealing with the various challenges that we've had collectively to see how we can solve them together. We also have the training for assessors, but also for sustainability managers of festivals, and the Green Events and Innovations Conference that happens every year with ILMC, where we bring everybody together to try and deal with problems and share best practice, essentially. So of these various activities that we do, this is an example that I want to share, which I really love because it kind of hits quite a lot of the issues all in one go. It's Digital Festival, DGTL, in Amsterdam. It's actually, there's something funny with the slides, so you can't see the data on there, but I'll talk you through it anyway. Essentially, they've created a circular food court. And as Chiara mentioned earlier, one of our big impacts is our food impacts in agriculture, but it is very difficult sometimes to measure. Despite that, there's a lot of actions that we can take that actually won't cost us anything extra. And that's the beauty of this. And you can even have more of a positive impact than if your festival was not happening, if you can make people's food choices actually better. So this is a win-win-win in every possible way. So the circular food court that Digital Festival put together, first thing they did was at source looked for food that would have been waste. So already off the bat, they're reducing emissions by taking that food and preventing it from going into landfill, let's say, or compost. So that's a win from the very outset, reducing carbon emissions in the value chain. Then they made sure that it was all 100% vegetarian. I'm not sure it was 100% plant-based or vegan, actually, but certainly vegetarian. And they made sure that they'd checked with the food serveware that it could actually be composted in a specific facility after the event. And that's crucial because often we see that things are used and not necessarily the full process has been checked. So you end up having the best intentions, but it doesn't actually result in what you were aiming at. And you can end up losing your compost, for instance, to landfill or to incinerator when it could have gone to anaerobic digester or to compost. So they had compostable serveware, plant-based or vegetarian food that had come from would have been waste sources. They made sure that it was composted, and then this compost could then be used in agriculture to grow food that can then be used in the local area. So that's a very circular system, and it's something that touches upon this concept of regeneration, where actually your event happening has a positive impact on the environment around you, other than just not being so bad. So being actually better. So this is one of my favorite examples. And they also had a lineup of chefs instead of lots of different caterers called the chef lineup. That's like the official title of that operation. And they would curate the food essentially based upon what waste food was available that day. So I suggest checking them out. They've got a lot of other circular systems in place as well. And then because we're running out of time, I'm going to hand over now back to Chiara in case there's any questions, and happy to talk through any other topics otherwise.
Thanks, Claire. I think we'll both take questions. So we have had a few, at least one more in the chat. Any ideas for incentives to travel sustainably at a free festival? I can think of a couple of examples depending on what your festival's laid out like. For example, if you're a city centre, a festival taking place over multiple locations. One example, which is Bournemouth Arts by the Sea, so arts festival rather than music festival. But what they did is on the festival's site map, they really clearly marked where all the bicycle parking spaces were, lockups across the city, including how many spaces roughly, so that if you were a festival goer, you had that in your mind and you could sort of plan ahead and plan your journey by bicycle. Other incentives to travel sustainably. Claire, I don't know if you want to jump in with any examples rather than it just being me talking.
Sure. I think the communication is one of the main things, and also disincentives as well as incentives, because there's only going to be a certain percentage of people who are on board actually for making the choices for sustainability. And actually what it needs to be is the easier, more practical choice. So for example, if you're a free event and parking is not very easy, or it's going to be more complicated or more expensive to travel by car, then really highlight that. And also in the communication of how you're making people know how to get to you, show how easy it is to use public transport. Like Chiara said, really signposting it and making it the natural choice just because it's the easier choice. That's going to be the key, because to talk about sustainability for everyone is not something that floats everyone's boat, essentially.
I think especially when it comes to audience travel, it's thinking through when the right time is to get information to people. So it can be really helpful to sort of map out where and when audiences are making decisions, or kind of, you know, if you're a ticketed festival, they may or may not be making decisions on how to travel when they buy the tickets. So how can you make sure that you also get that information to them closer to the time when they're actually planning on how to get to site? If you're a free festival, it's sort of making sure that that travel information isn't hidden somewhere in the bowels of your website, but is actually there, say on a Facebook event, or kind of at the, you know, highlighted from your front page when people are making that decision to come to you.
Just to add to that, first, I'd never thought about the bowels of a website before. The mind boggles. But also, even if it's a free event, the cities that you operate in, or the towns that we're operating in, everybody has got the agenda to try and increase public transport. And so you as an event can potentially be helping the local transport networks, the local public transport networks, by bringing a kind of a more exciting or different approach than a local authority can to public transport users. So it might be that you can still get some kind of special offers for public transport, or deals with people, or connections with small businesses, that if you come and present your bus ticket or train ticket, then you can get some kind of benefit. It doesn't need to be connected to your event tickets necessarily. So there's scope there as well for partnerships.
Brilliant. Hopefully that's plenty of ideas for thought. Louisa wants to ask about, do you have any recommendations for cup choices, paper ones versus recycled PET? Also ideas on how to promote recycling bins on site. Oh, it's the cup question. I think if reusable cups are not a viable option for you, I would first of all look at them again and make sure they really aren't a viable option, because they're becoming so much more commonplace, and there's so many rental companies now that are offering reusable cups as a service. But in terms of choices beyond that, I think a really key one is to understand what your waste solutions are, and how you're capturing those. So paper cups all have a certain kind of either plastic or bioplastic lining. So if you want to send your paper cups for recycling, usually that has to be done at specialist facilities, which might mean actually collecting those cups separately. So bigger events, like some Festival Republic events that use PLA lined paper cups actually put a levy on those cups to try and collect as many of them so they can send them to specialist recycling facilities. Recycled PET, on the other hand, is a fairly decent choice because compared to a virgin plastic cup, it's got some recycled content in it, and your recycled PET can go to more or less any plastic recycling facility as long as you've made sure, again, that your recycling is relatively clean and not too contaminated by things like food waste that are going to mean it can't be recycled. Anything to add to that, Claire?
Yeah, we've done quite a few studies on cups, and like Chiara said, it does depend on what facilities you've got for where it can go afterwards, and how you manage it on site is the crucial element. And we did, for example, with BST, they chose to implement paper cups on their site because of the large volumes of people coming and going in an instant, and they made sure that PLA lined cup, so the bioplastic lined cup, could actually go to a specific facility, and they had to test it in advance. So you need to go that far with it if you're going to make a relatively unusual choice. And then they worked with the My Cause volunteers to man the bins on site, and that's how they controlled the waste streams. And that was really effective, actually, to actually have people saying, this needs to go in this bin, this needs to go in this bin, and then helping to sort it as well. So if you're going to have different waste streams, then you need to have that kind of level of management on site if you're not using a deposit scheme. And as far as promoting recycling bins on site, if that's like to audiences, again, I just say really clearly marking them so it's very simple and easy and straightforward, and always grouping them together as well, so that if you turn up and you don't have the right bin, there's only a small fraction of people that will actually go and find the right bin. Most people will just chuck it in for convenience. And then also making sure that it matches where the waste is actually going afterwards, or else you may just be wasting your resources and time. So looking at that full cycle. Most waste management companies now for festivals are really quite on it, because, you know, we've been chipping away at this for so long. So working in partnership with them, making sure procurements, what you purchase, your bars, your food, everything that's coming in, matches with the waste management operations, matches with the waste facilities that you're going to afterwards.
And on that as well, again, making it as easy as possible for people to choose the right bin, depending on what systems you've put in place, either by using volunteers, like Clara said, or in some cases as well, reducing the holes on the bins so that people can't just chuck stuff in. They actually have to more deliberately take a moment to think about how they're going to get stuff into the bin, which hopefully gives them a moment to think about whether they're using the right bin. Some events have done that. I think Greenbelt have had a lot of success effectively working like that. And also with the signage, trying to make the signage as clear as possible. If you can actually list, you know, the specific items that are on your festival site, because you know they're there because they're what you've bought, and which bin they go into. Yeah. Any other questions? We're coming up to the hour.
While we're waiting to see if there are any more questions, one more point on that is there's examples such as Paradise City in Belgium. We went to assess them, and they only had one type of bin, and I thought that this was like an outstanding greener festival, and then it turned out that that's because they literally only had one waste stream. So the only waste that they had on site was compostable. Everything else was reusable. The only problem was people bringing in cigarettes, so they had separate cigarette collections, but that did mean that they were controlling what came in from the audiences as well, because if you've got everyone going to the supermarket in advance, you're not going to be able to have one waste stream, for instance. But it shows that it is possible, and then actually the separation becomes not the issue. It's just making it a kind of homogenous waste stream in that respect. So that's a possibility as well.
Yeah, and that's what you're weighing up a lot of the time, especially when you're choosing sometimes what could be more sustainable materials. You might be complicating your waste management because if you have to collect them separately. So again, always thinking through from start to finish, from what you buy all the way to where it goes at the end.
So I was just going to say, and then also looking at what are actually the big wins that you can manage and handle quite quickly. And energy, transport and food are the biggest impacts, really. And so if you can look at what can you do that's not going to cost you money, that's not going to be a huge amount of resources, that could potentially save you money, then certainly at this point in time, try and tackle those first, like not wasting energy and fuel, or switching to plant-based. You can, even if you're not ready to go to plant-based, make meat and dairy the special meal option for your crew, for instance, instead of the vegan being the special meal option. So just switch it around so that it has to be a choice to make the wrong choice rather than a choice to make the right choice.
And that's the final question coming through from Louisa as well. Other than sustainable behaviours we can look at internally as organisers, is there any other sustainable behaviours you recommend promoting on site for customers? So I think food is a really, really big one, and events that have used the opportunity of opening up a conversation around food, like Shambhala, like Digital, like Way Out West in Sweden, have done so very, very successfully, because it's opening up a conversation about what we want our future to look like and what it could look like. And another big area of sustainable behavior is, again, going back to how are people actually coming to your site. So in the UK, some of the big behavior change pieces are really about food and what people eat and how people get around. So if you're thinking about what to speak to audiences about, those are two big ones. And then the last one might be, depending on if you're open for more campaigning, is like actually working with people to get them politically active. Having those panels, conversations, looking at things like voter registration, not necessarily telling people how to vote, especially if you're a charity, you're not allowed to do that. But you could do things like voter registration drives to get more people actually politically active, and sort of working on that level and speaking to people about the future that we want. Any other thoughts on that, Claire?
I think that you've summed that up really nicely. I was wondering whether Martin Bloor's comment had been picked up about public transport networks. Did you speak about that when I blipped out earlier?
Yes, yeah, we did. We did talk about that. Fantastic. Well, on that note, we are to time, so it's time to wrap. But thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. A second thanks to Jed again for bearing with the repetition at the start. So if you are tuning in to either the venues or artists and management conversations next week, the start will be quite similar again. Again, this is because we know not everyone is tuning in for all of them. A lot of people are picking and choosing depending on what there is most relevant to them. So thank you so much, and we hope to catch up with many of you in the future. And if you have any other questions or comments or thoughts on the live Beyond Zero Vision, again, either share them with your membership associations to feed back into the steering group, or sort of keep up to date with the process overall via live. Thank you, Claire, as well. And
thank you, pleasure.
See you all soon. Thanks.